Hey guys, what's happening? So after much request and a bit of me seeing your conversations in the comment sections of my other videos pertaining to Marvel Legacy, I've noticed that quite a few of you have wanted me to talk about the Sentry, especially with everything going on in the 2018 Jeff Lemire series. So today we're going to crack open that discussion. So if you're new to the channel, be sure to subscribe to catch the spills every week, and don't forget to hit that bell up top so we can squat up in the comments for the first hour. Alright, so first things first, I haven't done a lot of Sentry videos for a few reasons, and we've talked about the Sentry a number of times on this channel in relation to other characters like Daken during the events of Siege and Dark Reign, and mostly in the context of comparison or whichever crossover with other characters. But as far as just a video on Sentry, it has been a minute since I've done a video just on him, and I had to call myself out on that. And one of the main reasons why is because a lot of you guys know this is a solo show, and because of that, not only do I not have the time to do videos on every single thing I read, but because I can only edit so many, I tend to tie in a lot of those references into videos where those stories or those characters may pop up. And for a while that's really been the case with the Sentry, because he's one of those characters whose narrative from the early 2000s when we had Marvel Knights, the series, like from then all the way up until now, his story has been broken up so many different ways between Siege, New Avengers, Mighty Avengers, Dark Avengers. It's all over the place, and we can perhaps go back and pick it apart if you guys want, but I guess in a way this video is kind of like a testing ground to see where you guys want to go with that. But moving forward into Marvel Legacy and just talking about what's going on, what everybody's up to, and continuing that conversation concerning the Sentry. The story of the Sentry in Marvel Legacy really picks up in Doctor Strange in the middle of your Loki Sorcerer Supreme, which also takes place during the War of Realms while more of the invasions are going on. And I'll leave a link in the description for the War of Realms playlist, because that's where I'm going to be covering more of those connections and what Loki is up to. And I'm pretty sure that's where I'm going to put the What is Loki Up To video, as far as his grand scheme in Marvel Legacy. But as far as where we find the Sentry more recently in the issues of Doctor Strange, it happens when Doctor Strange loses the title of Sorcerer Supreme. And when it happened, you can tell it was kind of weird, because even though he won the contest, which was supposedly the contest to hold the title of Sorcerer Supreme, like even though he won that contest, the Vishanti was like, okay, yeah, you won, but we're gonna give it to Loki, which was really weird. But it was done so well that you were just like, dang, that's messed up. But as a result, this led Strange to go to Asgard to harness power from Yggdrasil, but in order to handle all that power, he needed a strong anchor, and that's where the Sentry came in. And this worked well in a number of ways, because one, the Sentry is nigh indestructible, and two, after Doctor Strange gets the power he needs and he defeats Loki, it continues to show us the relationship between Doctor Strange and the Sentry. Because at the end of the day, when Strange returns to the Sanctum Sanctorum and we find out that the whole thing is really just a trick from Loki to show Doctor Strange where he stands in comparison to everything that's happening in Marvel Legacy right now, with the Celestials, the War of Realms, Damnation with Mephisto, the Infinity Stones. Like, the whole trick was really just a heads up. But when they get back to the Sanctum, Loki tells Doctor Strange to open this one door, the one door he couldn't open. And it's funny because the last thing, what I'm sure is the last thing that was on Loki's mind to be behind that door, was actually behind that door, and it was none other than the Void, who Doctor Strange has separated from the Sentry and locked away. But Loki, he's scared out of his mind, because during Siege, this dude killed Loki with no effort whatsoever. And when Strange opens the door, the Void is just like, didn't I kill you? And you can imagine for Loki, like at this moment, like what's to keep the Void from just doing that again? Easily. But of course, fortunate for Loki, that didn't happen. The Sentry returned and they locked the Void back away. And as far as the Sentry, even though this did create a rift between him and Doctor Strange for him just opening the door, which he wasn't supposed to for any reason, but what we end up finding out is that later, with the help of Tony Stark, Doctor Strange actually traps the Void within a pocket dimension in the mind of Robert Reynolds. But the catch is Robert Reynolds has to visit this place once every 24 hours. And we're not really given the explanation to why specifically this change was made, but I would make a guess, mainly from what we've heard from either Misty Knight or Tony Stark, or even from what we've seen happen with Doctor Strange, is that this was done as a solution to give Robert Reynolds the illusion of trust, while also keeping him, the Void, and the Sentry kind of on a short leash, so if they needed to lock them away, all three could be contained in the same place. But there's a problem with that, and we'll get to that in just a little bit. But in this pocket dimension within the mind of Robert Reynolds, it's set up very much like the real world, with the exception that here there are no real consequences. So in this dimension as a Sentry, he can punch the moon in half, but come back a day later and it'll be fully intact. But every day that he returns to this dimension, he has to defeat the Void before going back to his life in the real world. And during his time in the real world, he works a regular job with his ex-sidekick Billy Turner, formerly known as Scout. And both Billy and Jenny, who he works with and he sees every day, they're also heroes in the pocket dimension. It's pretty crazy. Very Black Mirror-ish. Like season 4, I forget the episode number. But in order for Robert Reynolds to keep up, he has a watch and a device called a Confluctor, so he knows exactly how long he has before he needs to go back in. And the way it works, he needs to go back in this once every 24 hours, because if he neglects to do so, then the Void will eventually make its way out. And then after that, everybody in the real world's gonna die. But going back and forth between the two, when Robert gets back to work, he's able to tell Billy a bit about the adventures that he goes through. And for the most part, when Billy hears it, he's like, yeah, that's great. But it comes to a point where he's like, well, what about me? Because even though their run as heroes is, quote, over, for Billy, he has no escape. Every day he lives the reality of being an amputee who's had his arm ripped off by the Void. And for Billy, that is his life every day. There's no escape from that. And it's a crazy dynamic between them, which kind of reaches back to some of what we've seen before. But I love the way that it's flipped here, because Billy goes behind Robert's back and steals the Confluctor. And not so he can be the hero in some dream world, but so that he can be the Sentry in the real world. And he does so by recruiting Cranio, who was once one of their greatest villains and had like the tri-level mind, you know, evil genius type stuff, but he entices him with the personal notes of Dr. Cornelius and the opportunity to be nearly a god in this pocket dimension. But Billy's more focused on him using those notes to recreate the serum that created the Sentry so that Billy can access that power in the real world. Because Billy wants to be the Sentry for real and not like in an imaginary fake world. But when the Confluctor is taken, Robert initially reached out to Doctor Strange. He reached out to Tony Stark and he couldn't get in touch with either one of them. And after trying to figure out everything on his own and even going to Billy at one point, Robert's taken into custody to where he finds out that Tony's like, look, just stay here and we'll figure it out. But as far as Robert's concerned, the Sentry is the only means of figuring this out. And from there, he transforms into the Sentry, knowing the risk that he's causing to the real world by leading the Void there. But with time not being on their side, he just sees this as his best option. But at this point, after having the help of Doctor Strange and Tony Stark, when he transforms into the Sentry for the first time since then, something's different. Because this time, his regular identity is actually transferred into the pocket dimension while the Sentry is in the real world. And this was not supposed to happen because, for one, Robert was not supposed to transform into the Sentry as part of their agreement. But when he does and he's discovered by Cranio, this information then gets back to Billy. And once Billy discovers that the real Sentry is out in the real world, of course at that point he kind of flips out like, oh my god, gotta do something. And so as a result, he ends up taking the serum that was reconstructed by Cranio before it could even be tested. And I gotta say that this is something that we could see turn around and have some crazy effects later on, because the serum that went right, it has some crazy effects itself, so you can imagine what this is gonna do. And as a matter of fact, I'm expecting that to go nuts in Marvel Legacy just because everything else that's going on right now. But as far as Robert Reynolds, who is in this pocket dimension with the Void at this moment, while he's in here, he actually gives in to the Void. Because the way he sees it, between himself, the Sentry, and the Void, they're all one person. And for the longest, he's been in this battle either trying to suppress, resist, or lock away the Void. But he comes to a point here where he's virtually powerless in this dimension. Cranio is just back in here going crazy, like a griefer in GTA 5. So Robert's like, you know what? I'm not gonna fight anymore. I'm gonna give in. And when he does, all three of his identities merge into one. And when that happens, he becomes the all-new Sentry. And I'm telling you, man, like, from here forward, Marvel Legacy is turning into Dragon Ball Z. Because I don't know who's gonna be able to handle this guy. And from the looks of it, everybody's getting an upgrade. And I'm not gonna front, like, the way things are shaping now, it's like the perfect world for Blue Marvel to just pop out. And power wise, like now, it's hard to say where he's gonna land, but I would like to see it. But another thing before we wrap up, I know a few of you guys were mentioning about Doctor Strange and before, when Robert Reynolds had originally reached out to Doctor Strange and Tony Stark, and we'd seen where Tony responded late, but Doctor Strange we never really heard from. And for Tony Stark, the argument can be made that it was happening during the hunt for Wolverine, and that's why he was occupied. But then again, if I'm hunting for Wolverine and the Sentry's freaking out, I'm going back to the Sentry to see what's going on. That's just me. But as far as Doctor Strange, we know in his case that he is preoccupied with everything going on with Doctor Strange Damnation taking place right after his run-in with Loki. In between the points that take place in Vegas and him traveling to other realms dealing with Mephisto, I can 100% understand him not being reachable. But either way, let me know what you guys think down in the comments about this all new Sentry. Like, what now? Like, who can even contest this guy? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments, and we'll do it again in the next one. All right, later.